All right, Nehemiah, I got a joke for you. You can determine if it's a good joke or not, or a funny joke. But who is the shortest person in the Bible? Some people say Nehemiah. And other people say it's Bildad, the Shuhite. But it was neither one of those. It was Peter, because he slept on his watch. So at least y'all laugh. All right, Nehemiah is all about leadership. I mean, there's a lot more to it there, but we learned so many lessons about what a leader is and what a leader does from Nehemiah. Now, if you go to any bookstore, if you do a search on Amazon, you will come up with thousands upon thousands of leadership books. And I'm going to tell you a secret. Most of those books are just rehashing the same material over and over and over again, just presenting it in a different way. Maybe the stories, the illustrations change, but the information hasn't really changed in all these years. So the notes that I gave you are really just loose notes and kind of a guideline to keep us going, or just so you don't have to write so much down. I gave it to you. All right. So there are going to be a few blanks I'm going to have you fill in and answer some questions as we get to it. But look at the top here. I gave you kind of an outline. If you were writing a book about leadership, these are some of the topics that you would probably address. For example, you talk about what a leader is and what it means to be a leader. You would talk about these other things. You learn how to gather information and form workable plans. You think about your job, right? That's one thing that your boss is going to expect from you, is you got to be able to handle the information and work from it. It means getting other people motivated. Now, is that easy or hard?
Hard.
Yeah, it's tough, especially if they don't want to be there, right? Manage a difficult boss. You know, what do you do then?
Right.
Get other people to do what you want them to do and get them to like doing that. Yeah, that's a difficult thing. How about overcoming obstacles? By the way, does obstacles happen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. No matter what area you're talking about, whether it's work or home or school or just life in general, obstacles are going to be there. Succeed where others have failed. There may be lots of others who have tried something and you say, well, let's try this a little bit different. Or win without intimidation. And the thing is, you could find these topics and these guides in a leadership book, but every single one of these topics are found right here in Nehemiah and in the life of Nehemiah. So we're going to look at some of these things. We're going to look at all these tonight. But the most important element, okay, of leadership, and this is coming from a Christian biblical perspective, the most important element is that a leader is a man of God or a woman of God. Okay, so you can write that down. A man of God or a woman of God. Nehemiah certainly was a man of God. We're gonna explore that as we study this book. Now, just to give you a little bit of background about who he was and what he did, Nehemiah went to the ancient Jewish capital of Jerusalem from the Persian Empire. So he was born in captivity. He's Jewish, but born in the capital of Susa, the Persian capital of Susa. He went to Jerusalem in 445 BC. Okay, so just kind of 400 years roughly before Christ. Okay, and the reason why he went is his goal was to rebuild Jerusalem. Okay, I'm gonna give you some more facts about that in just a little bit. But Jerusalem had been in ruins for about 150 years. Just since the Babylonians marched in and destroyed everything, Jerusalem really was not the great city that it used to be, or the city even that we know it as today. So Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, attacked Judah, and in the process of attacking the kingdom of Judah, captured Jerusalem, the capital, and burned it, destroyed the temple, took everything that he wanted back, and took most of the people. So if you want to read about that, read the book of Daniel. And you'll find some of the captives that are being talked about there. But Jerusalem had been burned. A lot of the wall surrounding the city had been just completely destroyed and stones were lying everywhere. Now you can imagine what happens to your yard if you don't keep up with it. Yeah, everything's growing, right?
Yeah.
Can you imagine almost 150 years of everything just laying in ruins? What the city of Jerusalem would have looked like? Just trees and shrubs and grasses and everything all over the city. Chaos quickly ensues. So Nehemiah, in going back to Jerusalem, he faced a difficult task. This is going to be a hard assignment. So let's look at Nehemiah chapter 1. By the way, is everybody there?
Yes.
Everybody found it? Okay. Nehemiah 1, we're going to read verses 1 through 11. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked him concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province, who had survived the exile, is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And we'll just, I know we said we will read verses 1 through 11. We'll get to those. So let's just pause right there. So what is the problem? What do we learn right off the bat? What's the problem? Yeah, so the exiles that are there, right, that came back, because part of the history is every once in a while a king would allow some people to go back, and he'd send them back to Jerusalem. But when they get there, there's problems, there's shambles, there's no funding, there's no real workforce to think about. You know how the Jews really didn't like the Samaritans in Jesus' day? Part of that's because in this time period, the Samaritans really gave the Jews trouble when they were trying to rebuild Jerusalem. So a lot of that stems from that same time period. So his brother shows up with some other people from Judah and tells them, look, things are really bad. And what is Nehemiah's immediate reaction?
Said
Ask and pray.
sat down and wept.
He wept, he cried about it, right? I mean, it was devastating to him to know after all this time, nothing had been done. Even though people had tried before. They had tried several times to rebuild the walls and rebuild the city itself, and every time failed. So he's getting this report. It wasn't like today, you know, we just instantly can find out information. He had to wait for it. So that's the condition he's in. Years ago, there was a modeling school that ran a advertising slogan. It went like this: be a model, or at least look like one. So that was their whole campaign. Be a model, or if you can't be a model, at least look like a model. So tonight, we're talking about leadership. I'm not interested in you looking like a leader. I want you to know what a leader is and how you can be a leader, okay? Looks is not the thing. Now, some people will assert that leaders are born. You ever heard of that? Leadership, he's a born leader. But that's not really the case, is it? No. Leadership can be taught. Leadership can be, you can be trained as a leader. In fact, I pulled up a quote by Vince Lombardi. Y'all remember Coach Lombardi? Green Bay Packers, multiple championships. Listen to what he said about leaders. He said, leaders are made. They are not born. And they are made just like anything else that has ever been made in this country, by hard effort, right? And that's the price that we all have to pay to achieve that goal, or any goal. And despite what we say about being born equal, none of us are really born equal, but rather unequal. And yet the talented are no more responsible for their birthright than the underprivileged. And the measure of each should be what each does in a specific situation. It is becoming increasingly difficult to be tolerant of a society which has sympathy only for the misfits, only for the maladjusted, only for the criminal, only for the loser. Have sympathy for them, help them, but I think it's also time for us to stand up for and cheer for the doer and the achiever, one who recognizes a problem and does something about it, one who looks for something extra to do for his country, the winner, the leader. He said that's what a leader is. It doesn't matter your background, doesn't matter your upbringing. A leader is someone who chooses to do something about something else, right? So that's what Coach Lombardi said about leadership. On your sheet there, what are some leaders that you can think of, past or present? You can jot those down or just answer out loud.
Well, biblically, King David.
All right, King David. Yeah, that's the next question, but you can, both of those questions go together. So King David was a leader, right? And he was really a leader from an early age. Even before he was king, you saw leadership was being developed in him. So that's a good example. Anybody else? Billy Graham. He's a good biblical teacher, leader, right? He preached the gospel. He lived what he preached. He lived it out daily. Ronald Reagan, President of the United States. He was a good leader.
Not all of them are.
No, they're not.
Of course, I know military leaders. George Patton.
George Patton was a leader. Yeah. Whether people liked him or not,
Oh, yeah.
he was certainly a leader.
He was a leader.
Colin Powell, yeah, he was a leader. That's right. So we all recognize leadership. We always recognize what people we would call leaders. And the fact is, we are in desperate need of true leaders today. We really are. And it doesn't matter what you're talking about. Politics, it could be church, it could be whatever. Schools, towns, cities, local politics, everything.
You can walk into a fast food place and just immediately, there's no leadership.
I experienced that today.
Did you?
Yeah. Never
That's
going to
getting common.
never going to McDonald's in Vienna again. This is horrible. But Nehemiah was a leader. And we recognize him as a leader because we see what he did and what he had to work with, and he got it done. Now, just some facts about Nehemiah again. He was Jewish. He was born in a Jewish family. He was born in exile in Babylon. And then Babylon was conquered by the Persian Empire, okay? So there's a lot of changing of hands that's going on during this time. He was raised in very dark times. There wasn't a lot of hope. Wasn't a lot of things to get excited about. He came right after Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so he's after those guys. He rose to a position of influence in the court of a foreign king. So here's a guy who started out with almost nothing, and God put him in a place of influence with the king. So he served as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. Okay, that was the Persian king or Persian emperor. What is a cupbearer?
Not sure.
They taste the wine to make sure that it's not poisoned or something.
That's exactly right.
And then they save the king or whatever.
Yeah, do y'all remember another cupbearer in Scripture? Think back to Genesis and Joseph. Remember Joseph was put in prison and he met two people that were on Pharaoh's bad side. He put them in prison. One was the baker, the chief baker, and one was the cupbearer.
That's right.
So a cupbearer has to be someone that's absolutely trusted. So someone that's going to take care of the king's, in the very literal sense of the word, his cup, make sure nothing's going to get in there, no one's going to poison. And actually he has to taste it to make sure nothing tastes funny, or he doesn't die first. Then the king can eat and drink. Okay, so it's a very trusted position. You don't get there by accident, right? You have a level of trust already. Now, what that became over time is an honorary title for someone that has an advisory role in a court. So, in Nehemiah's case, he quite literally was a cupbearer, but he was also a close advisor to King Artaxerxes. Another example of someone who rose almost from nothing and got to a high position like that was a man named Thomas Chaucer. And they say, who in the world was Thomas Chaucer? Well, you know at least about his dad. His dad was Geoffrey Chaucer. Now, he wrote the Canterbury Tales. Remember that? All right. Probably didn't want to read it in school. I didn't either. I've tried to read it as an adult, and I've never finished it. So anyway, but Thomas, his son, rose from almost obscurity to become a member of Parliament. And even after he served in Parliament, he became Speaker of the House of Commons 4 times. So he had a lot of influence. And then he went on from there to be a soldier who actually fought with or under Henry V and fought in some major battles, became a hero, so to speak. And then he got an honorary title. He was named Chief Butler to the King. So he served Henry V and he served Henry VI, and he became a close advisor, close friend and close advisor to the king. So that's just another example from history that we can look to that had similar influences. Now, Nehemiah found himself in a position of great influence in the Persian court. Now, again, just to give you some perspective, he's Jewish. The Persians didn't really like the Jews that much. They conquered them, took them, made them part of their empire. But he left. He actually ends up leaving this great position, which meant that he had all that he needed and all that he wanted. He leaves that to go back to Jerusalem to lead an almost impossible task. And you say, why would he do that? What do you think? Why would he possibly do that? What would cause somebody to leave a life of comfort and to have influence and be really at the highest position he could possibly reach without being king, and to turn his back on all that and go and...
A calling.
It's a calling. It is absolutely a calling. And we're going to see that he was a man of prayer, and so it was certainly a call on God on his life to do this at this particular time. Now, others, like I said, had tried over the past 100 years before Nehemiah. Other people rose up and tried to rebuild Jerusalem, and every single one of them failed. So why did Nehemiah think he was going to get it done? Again, it's a calling. It's something that he felt very, very much impressed to do by God. Now, where other people had failed over the past 100 years, guess how long it took Nehemiah to get the job done? The walls were complete in 52 days.
Wow.
52 days. We can't even get people to do stuff in 6 months around here.
Right.
So he got it done. He got it done in a record time. He was a successful leader against all the odds that we see that were stacked against him. Now, after that, he led a series of religious and moral reforms that had lasting effects for those 400 years before Jesus came on the scene. They had the most influence until Jesus himself stepped on this earth. All right, so he was very influential, very important. So we see the problem there. The walls are destroyed. Jerusalem's destroyed. I gave you a list of key events here just to give you a little bit of historical background on what's taken place. Of course, the big date there is 586 BC, the fall of Jerusalem. That's when you read in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one that came in and conquered Judah, and that's when Jerusalem fell. Then you have the rise of Belshazzar. Anybody remember him from the book of Daniel? Okay, this is the one that saw we even use this phrase today. He saw the handwriting on the wall. Remember, he quite literally saw a hand appear and was writing. You remember what he wrote? What the hand wrote? You have been weighed and you have been found wanting. In other words, your kingdom's over. You're done. So that's Belshazzar. He was replacing Nebuchadnezzar. Then in 539 BC, Babylon falls to Cyrus, who is the first king of Persia. At least in our timeline here. You can read about him in Ezra, in the book of Ezra. 522, you have the rise of Darius the Mede. He also is king of Persia. Haggai and Zechariah both reference him. In 486, you have the rise of Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, which if you read the book of Esther, he features very prominently in the book of Esther because Esther becomes his queen. Okay, so that's Xerxes. From the years 465 to 424, we have Artaxerxes the first. That's where we see when Nehemiah comes in. Artaxerxes is on the throne at this point. So you have 458, Ezra, who's a priest, arrives in Jerusalem, and he really leads an effort to rebuild the temple and get it finished, even though it's going to be another 15 years after he starts. And they build a foundation, but they can't finish it because of all kinds of problems. The problems they were having with the Samaritans who were keeping them from doing the work. And then you have Nehemiah show up in 445 BC. That brings us up to date in chapter 1. Okay, so that's what's taking place here. All right, next question. What makes a good leader?
Self-
Listens.
Someone who listens.
Selflessness.
Selflessness. Yes. What else?
Someone that's not afraid to make the hard decision when it's unpopular.
Yes, absolutely. A leader has to make hard decisions, even if people don't like it or they don't agree with it, right? Very good things. Anybody else want to?
Someone who serves alongside the people that they're leading.
Okay, yeah, servant.
Servant leader.
Yeah, servant leader, absolutely. Peter Drucker said effective executives do first things first, and they do one thing at a time. So if you're going to be successful, you're going to be a good leader, you put first things first. And what would we say are first things?
Come up with a plan.
Okay,
I mean,
to have a plan in
yeah,
place,
you gotta
right?
see what's the goal.
Yeah. And first things we can define as just those things that are most important. Because we can, there's some tasks that leaders do, we would say, well, that's not really that important. So what are the most important things that we have to do? Let's make sure we do those first. Does that make sense? So that brings in what? That P word, priority. We have to make the right priorities. All right. And then he says, do one thing at a time. That's just so you can be ordered and focused. Because if you lose your focus, you're probably going to lose your first things, right? All right, 2 principles. We want to establish priorities, what we just talked about, and then we want to manage our time effectively. Now, again, both of these things are tough. These are not easy to do. However, these 2 things are necessary if we're going to be leaders. We sometimes as leaders have to do hard things. Establishing priorities sounds easy, right? Well, it's easy to make a list. Anybody can make a list. But to follow through on that list, that's the hard part. To make sure your life is lining up with those priorities and you're focused on those priorities. Now, time management, that's going to be a work in progress, but you have to make the effort to not let things steal your time that aren't important. Okay, what are important things that we need to give our time to? God, first and foremost, our family, our church, our responsibility, our job. Those are things that need our time. Everything else comes under that and should come under that. All right, so the first priority on your sheet there that you can fill out is prayer. Prayer is the first priority, and that's exactly what we see Nehemiah do. Is that not what he did? He
Yes.
hears the news, he gets the bad report. The first thing he does is take it to God. Now, do you think that Nehemiah just, all of a sudden, this just happened, and he's like, well, I'm going to go pray to God about it? No. He was already in the habit of praying. He already had a relationship with God. He already took everything else to God. And so now when he's confronted with this, the first person he goes to is God. That's what we have to do.
That's probably why he did it in 52 days.
Yeah, absolutely. And prayer is the start of that. He prayed through the whole process, of course, but his first priority was prayer. Now, Abraham Lincoln said, I have been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. Now think about that for a moment. A man who was probably surrounded by more advisors that he could possibly ever want. But he said, I had nowhere else to go but to God. He says, my own wisdom and that of those about me seemed insufficient for the day. And don't we find ourselves in very similar circumstances a lot? Where we want answers or we want help, and we feel like there's really no answers and there's no help around us. So we got to ask God. We have to go to God. He's the only one that can provide. All right, any questions up to this point? And we're going to dive into the text itself, starting in verse 4. All right, again, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Okay, so that's what he does. The attitude with which we should pray. What kind of attitude should we have in prayer?
Positive.
Positive?
Submissive.
Submissive?
Open.
Yeah, you're coming God. You're not coming to God with this is what you got to do, God. You're saying, God, what do we do in this situation?
Yeah,
What do you want me to do?
crossed.
Right. That's right. So you're open. What else?
Be ready to accept.
Except
What,
anything
yeah,
that's
say
coming to you.
whatever you
Yeah,
say. That's
whatever
what
the
you
answer
do.
is. Yeah, you got to be prepared for that too. Because a lot of times we pray and we ask God, but He gives us an answer and we're like, well, what's next? What's the next answer? Let's keep
Yeah, that's not what I want.
multiple choice, right? So, not arrogant. We can say that, right? He didn't go to God in arrogance. He was courageous and bold, but he was also humble. He was humble. He had humility. You see here, he had tears. He fasted, and the fasting, of course, went with the prayer. So he could have a focused time of prayer. He wasn't presumptuous. When you ask God, in Nehemiah's case, he went to God. He's asking for help. He's not presuming God to do anything, right? But he does recognize if anything's going to happen, it's got to be God. If there's any help available, it's got to come from God. So that's his attitude. He's submissive. He's serious. He's a prayer warrior, and this is his life. Now look at verses 5 through 11. We see the whole prayer here. So this is what he prays. I said, "O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I've chosen to make my name dwell there. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name. And give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was cupbearer to the king." Okay, so right there at the end of verse 11, where he prays that God would grant mercy in the sight of this man, who is he talking about?
Himself.
Not himself. Who's he got to go talk to?
The king.
The king. So the king is the key to this plan, but he's not the whole key. God is the one who can move the heart of the king. So that's why Nehemiah is taking these requests to God, because God is the only one that can deal with it. Have you ever tried to convince somebody of something that they didn't want to be convinced of? It's almost impossible. But God can. God can work where we can't. He can get right into the heart, right? So we see this prayer, and I put it on here, the ACTS. You ever heard that acronym before? Adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. Well, really, if you look at his prayer, it's broken down like that. I mean, look at what he starts with in verses 5 and 6. O Lord God of heaven. So already he's recognizing who God is, right? Where he is. The great and awesome God. So he already says he's great. He's awesome. But what else does he do? He keeps his covenant. That means he's faithful. God, you are faithful. God, you are steadfast in your love with those who love you and keep your commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open and hear the prayer of your servant, and I now pray before you night and day. Confession, he gets right into that, right? Verse 6. Confessing the sins of the people of Israel, with which, what does he say?
We sinned against
We. Did he distance himself from the Jews? No, he's like, I'm one of them. In fact, he goes further than that, doesn't he? I am my Father's house. My own people, my own family, we have sinned against you. He says, I have sinned against you. So he's very humble here. He's confessing his sins to God. We have acted very corruptly against you. I mean, just think about it. Think about all the things they had gone through, and he's recognizing something. God, we have royally messed up. The whole reason why they're in captivity is because they wouldn't listen to God. And they wouldn't listen to the people God sent to talk to them. We haven't kept your commandments. We haven't kept your statutes, your rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Now look at verses 8 through 10. This is where he gets into Thanksgiving. Remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to that place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. Now, just real quick, anybody know where that comes from? How does Nehemiah know this? He references Moses, but what specific book of Moses? If you ever read Deuteronomy, it goes through a whole list of blessings that God's going to bless the people with. He says, I'm only going to do this if you obey me and listen to me. And then he does a whole other list of curses, right? This is what's going to happen to you if you turn your back on me. Now, what did the people do? They turned their back on God, and God gave them exactly what he said he was going to do from the very beginning of the formation of the nation. So in verse 10, he says, they are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and your strong hand. So even there, he's recognizing, God, you are the Savior. And he's not actually coming out and saying the words, thank you, but isn't that what he's doing? Thank you for being who you are. Thank you for being the one that can rescue us and save us. And then we see supplication. His real request comes in verse 11. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name. Give success to your servant today. There he's talking about himself. Give success to me and grant him mercy in the sight of the king. All right? So he recognizes, again, the king is the key to the plan, but he's already knows that God is the key to changing the king's heart. All right? So how do you get people to change their minds?
Spend time with them, and I call them, give them ownership in what we're doing.
Yeah.
Buy-in.
That's right.
Show them love.
So they,
Show them love.
yeah, get them to where they desire to do
Right.
that instead of have to do that.
That's right.
I bet it won't work with everybody.
It won't work with everybody, and it's very difficult. Like you said, it takes a long time of recognizing, okay, this person really does care about me. Maybe I should listen to them a little bit. Now, in Nehemiah's case, I'll get to you in just a second. In Nehemiah's case, he probably didn't have that kind of opportunity, that relationship. What the king said, that's what went. Okay, can you imagine just how bold Nehemiah really had to be to step up and say, I want to go. I want to leave. That would have been a big deal. Yes, ma'am.
It will work. It will, but it will work not our time, and that's what
That's
we have
right.
to. We have to remember that it happens in God's time, and maybe this is something that we have to go through to help that person, but it will work eventually.
Yes,
Even if it's at the rapture and we're in heaven.
that's right.
It will
Ultimately,
work.
God wins. Yeah. Real quick, go to chapter 2, verse 1. I want to point this out before we close tonight. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing that you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. And then I was very much afraid. And then he gives his request. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and the gates have been destroyed by fire? And he's going to go on to ask the king. The king's going to say, what would you do? I want to go back and rebuild. And the king gives his blessing. But what I want to point out, between chapter 1, when Nehemiah hears the news and starts praying, and chapter 2, when he's standing before the king having this conversation, 4 or 5 months has passed. So what has Nehemiah been doing that whole 4 or 5 months? Praying.
Praying, preparing.
4 or 5 months before he even said one word to the king about this. Now, what kind of perspective should that give us?
Sometimes we have to prepare.
We have to prepare. We have to pray and be persistent and persevere in prayer.
And let God lead us to that person.
Absolutely.
Not just say, okay, I've prayed about it, let's go do it.
To not totally manufacture a situation, but let God
Let
put
God
it
work
together,
it out.
right? Again, I put Proverbs 21:1 on there. That's the verse about God directs the king's heart. You know, just like a person can, in a garden, in a irrigation, the way that irrigation worked in those days, they can channel the water to different parts of the garden. And so he says, God is just like that person turning that water gate. He can turn the king's heart at a moment's notice. Now that's another good application for us, that we better be praying for our leaders. Yeah.
Yes.
Because God is the one that can change their hearts. We can't. God does. All right, the other passage I gave you there is Luke 11, verses 5 through 10. And this is actually the passage we'll close with tonight. Talking about persistence and perseverance in prayer. Luke 11, verses 5 through 10. And Jesus said to them, which of you who has a friend will go to him at midnight and say to him, friend, lend me 3 loaves, for a friend of mine has arrived on a journey, and I have nothing to set before him. And he will answer from within, do not bother me, the door is now shut, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot get up and give you anything. I tell you, though he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend, yet because of his what? This translation says impotence, he will rise and give him whatever he needs. In other words, this guy is so persistent, he won't leave his neighbor alone, that the neighbor finally decides, all right, I'll give it to you, just so you'll shut up. Right? That's persistence. And he says, I tell you, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, it will be open. Now what we don't see here in the English translation is the sense of that present tense verb. It's not just that you ask once. The idea is you keep on asking. It's an ongoing thing until God answers that prayer, one way or another, right? Or he gives you what you need. The whole point of Jesus saying this is that we have to be persistent in our prayers. Don't just give up, right? Don't just pray once and that's it. Well, I guess God's not listening. Well, maybe God just wants to know if you're really serious about what you're praying or not. And maybe he's trying to teach us something else in the process. And he wants us to hold on and wait for something that he's got planned that if we tried to run ahead of him, it wouldn't work out. So there's a lot of things we just don't consider sometimes. And we just need that perspective that only God can give to us.
God didn't give up.
And God certainly didn't give up. No.
He loved more like Christ.
He'll never give up. So before you persevere with people, in this case with Nehemiah, he was about to go persevere with the king, right? He didn't know what the king was going to do. He had no idea what the response was going to be. That's why he said he stood before the king and all of a sudden he was afraid. But yet he went forward with it. Sometimes we're going to be put in situations where even though we've been praying about it for a long time, we get to that moment and what happens? Fear might rise up and start knocking on us, right? But we got to push through it. God is with us. And we've been praying, if we've been praying it like he has, 4 to 5 months, don't you think he's sure by that time what he's supposed to do? Absolutely. Anything y'all want to add? So before we persevere with people, persevere with God first.
Yeah.